How can a God of all power and all love allow for evil in this world, especially if he knew in advance that the world would fall apart after he created it, and we would have atrocities and the sickness and the suffering that we have?
I think, John, this is the thorniest question, truly the one that probably most people ask. Someone put it in these words: virtue in distress and vice in triumph has made atheists of mankind. Or what Alfred Lord Tennyson said, never more to morning wore to evening, but that some heart did break. It is a painful question in itself because it deals with pain. Pain is a real thing. It's not an imaginary thing. There are many ways that one can approach an answer, but C.S. Lewis used to remind us that it is critically important to examine the assumptions within a question. And I remember years ago at the University of Nottingham, when I'd finished a talk, when a person stood up, or a student stood up and shouted from the floor, and he said, you know, there's too much of evil in this world. There can't be a God. There's too much of evil and suffering in this world. And the irony of that question to me was, you know, I come from the East, I now live in the West. I don't ever remember being asked this question in the East. Now they do because of all the cross-pollination of thinking and all of that. But it's hardly ever addressed. In Islam, you hardly ever find a book dealing with this subject. It's inshallah, it's the will of Allah, you know. And in the pantheistic system, it's karma, you're paying your debt and so on. It's in the Western world where we actually live with the greatest comforts that we raise the question about pain and suffering. But this Englishman raised it, and I said to him, why don't I make it clear first why you are asking this question and what your assumptions are. I said, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He paused and he said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled with this and we interacted, and finally he said, yeah, there would have to be an objective moral standard from which to differentiate between good and evil. I said, when you say there's a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? And he looked at me, paused, and he said, what then am I asking you? Now, this was years ago. I said, I know what you're asking, man. I'm not trying to make it hard for you. It's an existentially felt question that often doesn't examine the logical presuppositions within this. God has to remain in the paradigm for the question to be real, and therefore the answer has to come from what God's purposes and what God's description is all about reality. In a recent book that I co-authored with Vince Vitale, my colleague from Oxford, we called it Wise Suffering. My opening chapter was what is called the trilemma. God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, and there is evil. That's the trilemma. The three realities that J.L. Mackie, the Australian philosopher, says are incoherent. God is all-powerful, God is loving, evil exists. He says it's an incoherence. So my question is, why is it a trilemma and not a quadrilemma or a quintilemma? Introduce one more. God is all-knowing. That's also a belief we have. And number 5, God is eternal. God is not judging everything just in time. There's an eternity. So it's not just the question is stacked when it's stacked as a trilemma. God is also all-knowing, and eternity also exists as a reality. And maybe those explanations can come in eternity. Let me just move to 2 quick answers in this. There's a young gal in Georgia, where I live. I live in Atlanta. And her first name is Ashlyn. And one day her mother was on a television program discussing a strange problem that she has, which is called CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. She cannot feel pain and her sweat glands don't work. The problem may sound good, you don't feel any pain. But the reality is, if she steps on a nail while she's on the sports field, it could puncture the skin, create an infection, and nobody could be even aware of it. The mother said the problems it has created in her life for what this malady brings into her body. She says, I pray one prayer every night. God, please let my daughter help to feel pain. She could put her hand on a burner and not know that her hand is burning. Now, my question is this. If in our finite existence we can see the role of pain to warn us that something is wrong? Is it impossible for God in His infinite wisdom to allow pain in our lives to help us know that something is wrong? Pain is spelt with moral connotations in the human framework. That is because we are moral beings. Therefore, the answer has to come from within a moral, spiritual framework as well. The question assumes moral reasoning, and that can only be assumed if God is in the paradigm, not outside of it.
Have you ever wondered what you would do to frighten Lazarus after he'd been raised from the dead? What would you do to threaten him? Lazarus, I'm going to kill you. Caligula said, I'm going to kill you. He says, ha ha ha. And he says, stop ha-ha-haing, I'm going to kill you as I'm killing all the Christians. He doubles over in uncontrollable laughter, comes up for air and says, Caligula, haven't you heard? Death is dead. Death is dead. How do you frighten somebody who's already been there and knows the one who's going to let him out? But just think of stepping on shore and finding it heaven, of touching a hand and finding it God's hand, of breathing new air and finding it celestial, of waking up in glory and finding it home. Ladies and gentlemen, your hope and mine in Christ is that one day we will be with God. One day we will be with Him. We look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has spoken of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. I've heard a crazed, cracked Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a German Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown saying he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I have seen America more wealthier and in terms of military weaponry more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin is a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America is haunted by fears of running out of the precious fluids that keeps our motorways roaring and the smog settling. All in one lifetime, all in one lifetime, all gone with the wind. Behind the debris of the fallings of our solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists lies the gigantic figure of one person, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom mankind may still survive, the person of Jesus Christ. Isaiah calls him Wonderful Counselor. Peter looks at him and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The Apostle Paul, Saul at that time in Acts chapter 9 says, what shall you have me to do, Lord? Thomas raised his hand and touched his side and said, Thee, my Lord and my God, ho kurios mu, ho theos mu, the Lord of me, the God of me. When Pilate looked at him and said, Art thou the Christ? He says, you have said it. When the priest looked at him and said, Are you the Son of God? He says, you're right in stating that I am the Son of God. And in John chapter 14 he says, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am you may be also. Lord, where are you going? If we don't know where you're going, how can we find the way? I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No man comes unto the Father except through me. Show us the Father, Lord. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Philip, have you been with me so long and you don't know that when you've seen me, you've seen the Father? I and my Father are one. And he who believes in me, greater things than these shall he do.
¿Qué tal? Quisiera compartir con todos ustedes lo que este libro que tengo en mis manos, que se llama la Biblia, y se llama El Plan de Salvación. La Biblia nos muestra claramente que nosotros hemos nacido, ¿verdad?, destituidos de la gloria de Dios, y la Biblia dice también que la paga del pecado es la muerte. Y hay una gran barrera que hay entre nosotros y Dios. El pecado es precisamente como una barrera, y aquí está Dios, y aquí estamos nosotros, y hemos tratado de brincar esta barrera a través de nuestras buenas obras para poder tener otra vez y restaurar nuestra comunión con Dios. Sin embargo, la Biblia nos muestra que Dios es santo y que nosotros somos pecadores, y que la única forma en la que podemos nosotros acercarnos a Él es precisamente a través de lo que Él hizo en una cruz, en la sangre que Jesucristo derramó para pagar por nuestros pecados. ¿Qué es lo que tú necesitas para poder tener una vida nueva, para poder nacer de nuevo, para poder reconciliarte con Dios? Creer lo que en esa cruz Dios hizo. La cruz está en medio de Dios y de nosotros. En el momento en que tú pones tu confianza en la sangre derramada en esa cruz, Dios te regala por gracia. Dice la Biblia que por gracia somos salvos por medio de la fe, no por nuestras obras, para que nadie se gloríe. Y en ese momento Dios nos regala la salvación. Tú lo único que tienes que hacer es decirle a Dios en este momento: Señor, te pido que perdones mis pecados. Creo que soy un pecador. Creo que en esa cruz tú pagaste a través de tu Hijo con su sangre que derramó por mis pecados. Creo que a los 3 días tú lo levantaste de los muertos, y te pido, Señor Jesucristo, que entres a mi corazón como mi Señor y como mi Salvador. Una vez que tú haces eso, la Biblia dice que a todos los que le recibieron, a los que creen en su nombre, Dios les da el derecho, es un privilegio maravilloso de ser llamados hijos e hijas de Dios. Y en ese momento te conviertes en un hijo de Dios, en una hija de Dios, y le puedes ya llamar a Dios Padre Santo que estás en el cielo. Además dice la Biblia que en el momento que recibes a Jesucristo, vienes a formar parte de la iglesia. La iglesia no son los edificios, no es una construcción, somos todas las personas en el mundo entero que invocamos el nombre del Hijo de Dios. Yo te recomiendo que ahora todos los días apartes un lugar en las mañanas para leer la Biblia 10 o 15 minutos, porque la Biblia es Dios hablándonos al corazón. Comienza a orar. Orar es platicar con Dios, darle a conocer a Dios tus sentimientos, tus emociones, tus necesidades. Y en tercer lugar, únete a un grupo de personas que estudien la Biblia entre semana o en alguna iglesia cristiana para que puedas crecer en la salvación. Que Dios te bendiga, te guarde y te dé mucha paz.